Welcome to the 4 Everyday Leaders podcast. Brandon Faust, Alex Holt here with you today. Alex, why don't you tell us what this podcast is all about?
Yeah, this podcast is all about helping people lead in the everyday spaces and moments of life. Today we have with us Shane and Sherri Christopher. Sherri is the Senior Director at One America and author of her new book, Choosing Joy. Shane is the Development Officer at One Mission Society. He's deeply involved in overseas mission work, and he's also involved in real estate with a great initiative called MyHome4 Good. He's also the author of his new book, God in HD.
Shane, Sherri, welcome. Thanks for hanging out with us.
Thank you.
And this is the first time that we've ever had an interview with two guests at the same time. And not only two guests at the same time, but also they're married to each other. Right. So this is the first time we've interviewed husband and wife together.
Big deal today.
On the show. And I've known Sherri and Shane for 12 years now. I've known you.
Yeah.
And we served in student ministry together, sometimes willingly, sometimes begrudgingly, I'm sure. But, and just remember their heart for sacrificing and serving others and investing into youth and all that stuff. And they're involved with so many great things here around Central Indiana. But it is so good to be hanging out with you guys. 12 years later, you'll still talk to me, which is great.
Well, thank you.
So we want to go on a journey, and we're going to start with Sherri on this first question, then we'll get to you, Shane, second. But we want to... both of them, like Alex just said, have released books recently. Yep. And I don't know a lot of husband-wife teams that like are just releasing books at the same time. So that's a thing. And I know there's a little story about how Sherri getting ready to release a book motivated Shane to finish his, which is pretty cool. So I'm sure we'll hear about that. But Sherri, why don't you tell us about, because I don't know some of these, I've known you for a long time, but I don't know some of these pieces. Tell us about where you grew up and what was life like for Sherri growing up.
Sure. I grew up in Scipio, Indiana. It's a small town between Columbus, Indiana, and North Vernon.
Okay. I've never heard of that town.
No, and I've been here my whole life.
Yeah.
So
yeah, I mean, it's one of those towns where you can blink your eyes and you've gone through it. You don't even realize it. But small town girl. So we had a couple acres of land. My chores were gardening and doing all of those hard things around the yard. Yes. Lots of fruit trees, and we lived off the land a lot.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Fun. Tell us about then, as you got older, what kind of led you to like a path on your career? Where did you end up doing after high school? Kind of what were some of those formative things for you, I guess you would say, early on?
Yeah, sure. I really did not have interest in college. So I wanted to learn what I wanted to learn and went to school to get certified in medical dental administration. Took off to Pennsylvania, lived there, did that for a while, came back home 4 years later, worked in a medical environment that was unhealthy and decided to leave. And the first thing that came along that gave me an opportunity was One America. So I've now been there for about 32 years.
Wow. Oh my! I just feel like you don't hear that story anymore of people. It's like, if you've been somewhere 8, 5, 10 years, that's like, wow, that's crazy. In this kind of day and age. So to be somewhere for 30 plus years, that's pretty amazing.
That's amazing.
And I know that, since I've known you, obviously you've been there because I didn't meet you 30 years ago. I would have been a child. But so there's that. But, in the senior director role, all those kinds of things. What kind of drew you to the work at One America and then the path that you ended up on there doing what you're doing now?
Well, I would say what drew me there was it was something different.
Yeah.
I was unfamiliar with it. I like a challenge. And what probably kept me there was the fact that I was able to kind of create my own path in a sense.
Yeah.
I would see opportunities and I would propose those and they would agree with that, and then it would lead me down this journey of different roles. So I never was in the same role.
Yeah.
It was always changing.
I think what's great about that too is there's so many times I think there's this myth that everyone's like, well, I'm 18 and I went to college and the thing that I said I wanted to do, I just stayed with that for my whole life.
Yep.
Now, for some people, that does happen. It's the exception, not the rule. Yeah. And we feel like the more we tell these stories and interact with people in the nature of the work we do at Wayfinders, we find that people often shift into different career paths. They may stay at the same organization, but the organization's so big that it almost feels like you can have some sort of other career path.
Yeah.
And so I just love that. Even what you said, like, hey, I went into this dental medical kind of administration and then pivot to One America.
Yep.
Big pivot.
Cool.
Total change. But then staying in that at the same time for 30 some years is really, really cool.
And I think I can attest to Sherri liking a challenge. So Shane and Sherri were student leaders, like you mentioned, when I was a student.
Yeah.
In that
So
ministry.
they really were up for the challenge.
They really were up for the challenge of dealing with a student like me.
Yeah.
Shane, let's shift to you and ask those same questions. Talk to us a little bit about growing up. Where did you grow up? And then kind of that move. How did you get into college, career path? How did all that get started for you?
Okay, so it's very similar to Sherri. I grew up in a small town in Illinois called Spring Bay, so started with an S as well. Wonderful parents, very involved in our lives. Different activities. I did BMX, I did wrestling, things like that. My parents were always there.
The BMX, that actually adds up really well. Like, that makes a lot of sense.
It does make a lot of sense. I didn't know that, but wow.
So
he was a rebel from early on. I knew it.
yeah, I was BMX from about 13 until about 18, 19 years old.
Cool.
Went into cruisers as we got bigger. But so my dad worked for Caterpillar his whole life, and but was always there. He was always intentional to be there for everything. And so as parents go, they were great parents. I remember, like, when he worked second shift, my brother and I would stay up late, and he'd be cooking smoked sausage in a cast iron skillet, and my brother and I would sit there with him and eat the smoked sausage and stuff. So I just remember these things as a kid. So I had a good, I would say, a very good childhood in that aspect.
That's awesome.
Same aspect, I guess. As in anything, depending on who I was friends with and stuff, you'd have sometimes where you were in the group that got picked on and different things of that nature. Yeah. So I was kind of, at that time, maybe a little bit of a defender of the ones that were less. Which put me in the kind of that group as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. So how did you go from there? Did you go to college? What did you choose to study and then move into a career path?
So I get a bachelor's in finance. Illinois State University. And the reason I picked that was when I was in 8th grade, a friend of mine that had moved from California, his mom was still out in California, and she did not, she was having trouble with bills. And I actually sat down as an 8th grader and with him, and we put a budget together for her. And that's where I kind of realized at the time I liked doing that. I liked helping her with that.
Wow.
And that's how I ended up getting a degree in finance. Accounting sounded a little too boring for me. So I didn't want to be an accountant, but I wanted to do something that would involve helping people with their budgets.
Yeah.
So that transitioned various things. Unlike Sherri, I'm a little more free-spirited in a lot of things, so I kind of do what I do. But I at one point I was doing where I went into mortgages, and at that point I realized, and I had my own mortgage company, and I realized I was doing what was intended for me with helping people with their budgets and helping them refinance houses, do whatever it is to help their budget work for them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How did you then move into, because I remember some conversations around this, but moving into kind of real estate, moving into, missions work, that's been a really significant part of your career now the last several years. What's been going on there?
And we also have to ask, how did you two meet? How did you all come together in beautiful Indiana?
Sherri?
How did we meet? We met in a bar, dancing on the dance floor.
That's amazing. Yeah. So this all fits.
Shane,
I didn't know you guys for so long.
Shane, the BMX racer, hits the dance floor, and
so
you're just
good.
Electric moves, right?
I love it.
Yeah.
Well, I even made her a paper rose.
Yeah. He was living in Michigan, and I was in Indiana.
Okay.
So we had a long distance relationship for about, a year and a half?
Yeah.
That's awesome.
That's awesome. So Shane, how'd you end up on the career path that you're kind of doing now? What led to that?
So the real estate part, at the time I had my own mortgage office. And when I had the mortgage office, I started seeing all these other real estate offices starting their own mortgage company. Mm-hmm. And I was like, it was a takeaway business basically. Yeah. So I was like, I'm going to do the opposite. So I went and got my real estate license. And back then you got a salesperson license. And then after a year, you could do more classes and everything and get your broker license. So I did that. For 1 year, I stayed with a firm. After that year, I got my broker's license and started on my own and just started my own little real estate thing.
Very cool.
So that's how I got into the real estate.
Yeah.
Ran away from mortgage industry when in 2007, right before the big
the big crash.
There was quite an event in 2008.
Yeah. So I saw it coming and got out of there, knowing it was going to be a big issue, and have stayed with real estate since. So real estate wise, I've been 2002.
Wow.
Okay.
So I've always kept that as a thing I do. I would call myself more like a concierge realtor.
Mm-hmm.
The focus has been for the last 10 years in missions. So with the development role, that story is kind of an interesting one. I know we only have so much time. But let's just say God told me to go back to school. I looked at it, didn't listen. And then when I was in prison, one of the prison ministry.
There we go.
Good clarification there.
Thank you for that.
I was like, we got another story to tell here.
This is going to be a real long episode today.
So the first time God said, go to seminary, study theology. And at that time, I was a Christian, but I would say I didn't really research a lot. So I'm like, all right, what am I studying? And it's like, oh, I'm studying God. Okay, that makes sense. And but I didn't find anything that worked at the time. It just wasn't working with my schedule. And then when I was in prison, I had an offender who had been in prison. He had been an Orthodox Jew. He and I had conversations about his life. He accepted Christ that weekend. And once he did that, he came to me the next day and he said, God put something on my heart for you. And I said, what's that? He said, you're supposed to go to seminary and study theology.
Wow.
So that's how the road to missions. I did 3 years of getting MA in theological studies. And Sherri kept asking, what are we going to do with this? You're spending all this money. And at the time, I'm like, I don't know yet. God hasn't revealed it. And I walked into One Mission Society for a class, Perspectives. And when I was there, I was just like, this is where I'm supposed to be. So that's how I end up in missions.
That's amazing.
That's awesome.
And I mean, what a beautiful reminder too, that you never know how God's going to show up in your life and share something with you, nudge you.
Yep.
It could be through somebody you meet in prison. It could be through somebody in your family that you would least expect, or a neighbor or something like that. So that's a really cool story. Sherri, give us a little bit, as we come back to your story, give us a formative moment, a season of life that shaped your life, your leadership in some way, some capacity. You've been at One America, you've met Shane, all these different things that are happening in your life. What was a moment or a season that really kind of shaped your life, your leadership?
Yes, I think what probably changed the trajectory of me becoming the leader that I am today is when I saw the opportunity for improvement. I wrote a proposal, I presented it to the VP, and he accepted, and I now found myself moved into a brand new role that I had created. It was called a field supervisor, and I managed 24 regional offices with 28 employees. And so that was a brand new role. They trusted me, my vision, and so that was probably what really kind of kicked off my leadership in a new way.
Yeah.
She didn't only create the role, she wrote the job description.
Yes, I did that too.
Yeah. And I love that, that tenacity of seeing a problem, seeing something that could be better, and not just sitting back and saying, well, that's someone else's to fix, but stepping into that and saying, no, I think there's a solution. I may be the person to fill it, but I at least want to create the path forward for us as an organization to make this better and to move forward. I love that.
Well, and sometimes in our career, those become little sandboxes of how we solve problems and use skills in other aspects of our life too, which is really powerful when you have those reference points to say, hey, this was one of those kind of seminal moments of my life. And then you kind of take those experiences with you. Shane, how about for you? What was a moment, a season? I mean, obviously, someone sharing to you like, hey, in prison, hey, you need to go to seminary, like that's a thing. But what else was in there in a moment or season of life that shaped your life and leadership?
Well, the interesting thing I would say is, I not knowing it, but looking back, was the destiny to lead in some way, right? Which I think all of us have in us. Going back to when I was detasseling corn and being a crew leader, right? and then all the way through that was more about me and my path and what I was doing. And I would say it's when it became a flip of that, and it was more about empowering others, being able to lift them up and and accept them for who they were and try to put them in the best place they could be.
Yeah.
I think that would be the big flip for me was realizing that and it no longer being about me, and then looking back and seeing all the different things that God put into me that I was using for my own parts that now I could use to feed others.
Yeah.
So
I think that's the part. I mean, the whole heart of what we do as an organization and even this podcast is like, it doesn't matter someone's station or position or title. It's like, how are we showing up in the everyday as leaders to serve people? And we watch in, scripture, all of us here are Christians, like we watch Jesus kind of invert the notions of who can do what, of who has permission to lead, to serve, to set the example, and coming in, and a lot of people that we see raise up in the New Testament are unexpected kind of leaders that don't have all the stacked up resumes, some that do, but then it takes a kind of a crisis of belief, a transformation of some sort. So what's a everyday leadership principle, Sherri, that you've kind of carried with you, whether that's career oriented in everyday life? What's something that's really stuck with you that you've tried to embody over the last decade or so?
I think not just as a leader, but just as an associate as well. No matter what you're doing, I think the one thing that is really important is never send an email when you're upset.
That's so good.
And I always say, stick with the facts and leave the emotion out of it. And when you write the email and you're upset, put it in draft mode. Look at it the next day, or have somebody read it before you send it.
Yeah, and I think that principle then carries over into your everyday life at home, into other conversations, whether work or not work related. Like, hey, when you're about to rage or there's some sort of storm brewing,
take a minute.
Pause. Take a beat.
Yes.
Just take a beat there.
Don't hit send on the
text. Take a lap. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's so good. Shane, what about for you? As you look back at this incredible career and the amazing work you get to do, what's been an everyday leadership principle that is really just something that stands out to you?
There could be several, but I think one is everything's a relationship. So when everybody's a person and you can't misstep in that. And it's also knowing yourself, right? So for me, I even with working with One Mission Society, OMS, I tried for many years to stay away from any leadership role because I knew my own propensities. So I knew my own pride, my own things like that. And I had to get myself in the right headspace. Yeah. So that would be another thing, is know who you are and what your weaknesses are. Yeah. So,
yeah, I think there's a lot to be said where I've seen it, and many times people justify it because they're going to go do something good or do something big for God. And it's like, first of all, God doesn't need you.
Right.
He's going to be fine.
Yep.
But we get invited to be a player, a participant in the story, right? But so many times people like set some sort of sights. I got to do this, or I got to be this, or I got to hit this title, whether that's in the marketplace in a job, whether that's in some sort of church ministry or whatever, and they forget that principle that that's a person created in the image of God, just like me, regardless of title. And you may feel like you're at the bottom of the food chain of your organization, but there's still so many opportunities to lead, how you show up in the workplace, how you show up in your home, how you show up in your community, how you show up in the neighborhood. And there's so many times where people are just waiting to get the title to be able to do something. Right. And it's like, go, just go. You have, like Jesus said, if he called you to it and he's empowering you to do it, like you have permission.
Yes.
Please go. Yes. Now, don't flip over tables unnecessarily. You may have to do it once in a while, but
there are necessary times for sure. Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about something that you would really just encourage our leaders with, or our listeners with, right? As you think about the everyday leaders who listen to our podcast, what is something you would say, hey, as an encouragement? You may feel like you are sitting at the bottom of your organization. You may be at the top of your organization, but you feel like you just don't know how to lead in this season. What's something you could encourage our listeners with as they go into their everyday lives?
I would say just see the good in others and tell them, recognize it. I had a leader that one time kept promoting me, and promoted me all the way to the level of VP, and I felt very unqualified. But he said, no, you don't see what I see. And so when I felt unqualified, he would say, I'm with you all the way. You can do this. And so even when I doubted myself, he was always pushing me and showing me that I had what it took. So see that in other people, because sometimes people can't see it in themselves.
Yeah, it's that power of that I see in you conversation when you can see that in someone. And it's the small things, right? It's the small, even a small text that says, hey, like, you did an incredible job on this thing today, that can really dramatically impact someone's day, someone's next career move. That's awesome. Shane, what's something that you would share?
Well, as I said before, I spent a good chunk of my life in leadership type stuff where I did it all for me. And it was learning to be able to empower others, very similar. And as I would, probably the easiest thing I'd say is lead like Aaron. So be an Aaron for somebody else. Right. Because if you can be there to encourage them, to empower them, to come alongside them, to hold them accountable, to do those kinds of things, then you get way more joy out of that. That's the biggest thing. I've got so much more joy out of lifting other people up than I ever did in trying to bring myself up.
Yeah, that's good. Well, before we get into some of the things that you guys are involved with in the books that you've released recently, what's a book or a podcast that's impacted you somewhat recently, and why is that? Go ahead, Sherri.
Mine would be Crucial Conversations. It's one that is written by 4 or 5 different authors, and it gives you the tools to manage conversations. And this works not just in the work environment, but in everyday life. And so from a leadership perspective, you have people that are not performing well, or you have individuals that get escalated in emotions, or they shut down. And this really helps you to understand how to communicate in a way that you're doing so that opens them up or calms them down, or they might be on the wrong seat of the bus. They may not be in the right role. Yeah. And how do you tell somebody they're not in the right seat? Right.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Shane, what about you? And just a note, this is an opportunity to say that your wife's new book is the book that has really moved you.
I love that.
Sherri's book is
awesome. Or are we about to have a crucial conversation
right now?
Well, here's the funny thing. We talked about these questions a little bit, and the one book I mentioned was, I've read it a little while ago, but it was The Energy Bus, what she told me about. And the whole thing about putting people on the right seat of the bus, keeping people with the wrong energy off your bus, things of that nature. So when she said the bus, it was like this conversation we had earlier.
Yeah, that's awesome.
But to me, that's part of what we've been doing and stuff with where I'm working overseas is not saying, hey, you don't fit, but hey, you're doing something that is not how God designed you, or how let's get you in a place that's better for you. Yeah. And sometimes it's maybe here, sometimes somewhere else, but it's helping a person realize that. A lot of stuff you guys do, right?
Yeah. And I think helping creating those environments where people can discover that and not just be prescribed something. I'm not saying that there's never a time to do that, but where people can discover that, and then they can own it and be like, if I have permission to run in this lane, I'm actually really going to thrive and use my gifts and all those kinds of things.
Yeah, what is it? We use 98% of our energy doing the 2% of stuff we're not good at or don't like, and 2% of our energy doing the things that we're really good at.
Yeah.
So
that's good. That's a big deal.
All right, we can't leave this episode without you guys talking about these new books that you have both written. So Sherri, let's start with you. Talk about your book, Choosing Joy. What is it about? What kind of inspired you to write this book?
Yeah, so I never knew I was going to write a book. It was a surprise. And Shane and I had gone to see a C.S. Lewis documentary and got a popcorn in hand, wheeled back in the seat and ready to watch the movie. And the movie starts, and then I can't hear it. And I feel like I'm having this download of information, and I'm getting chapter titles. I'm getting book title, content. And the entire movie, I probably need to go rewatch it because I didn't hear it at all. And so I immediately came home. I wrote it down, everything I could remember, and Shane asked, what'd you think of the movie? I'm like, I couldn't hear it. And so it was a weird experience for me. I never really had that happen before. And so it took me on this journey of almost 2 years of writing this book, Choosing Joy. And it's really wrapped around, we go through all kinds of things in life. And as we go through things, not everything's perfect. And it's always a choice that we choose our thought patterns. It's how we respond. And sometimes we're in toxic environments, and how do you remove yourself from those environments? How do you, if you're married, your husband's not the enemy. How do you get those thought patterns back to a place that's healthy?
Yeah, that's so good and so encouraging, and I know will be so encouraging for folks to read that. Shane, talk to us about your book, God in HD.
So unlike Sherri, who's very task-oriented, lists and everything, I'm kind of the opposite. So I started writing it the name came to me about 13 years ago. I was sitting there and God's like, and obviously now we have 4K and all these other things, but he gave me the title, God in HD, and started having chapters and what it was. And it was after I finished seminary that I actually started putting words on paper. And for the next 9 years, I would do a little bit here, a little bit there, but I just wouldn't finish it.
Yeah.
And it took Sherri being encouraged with hers or getting hers done for me to say, well, why have I not finished this?
Yeah.
So her finishing hers, that's why mine's close at the same time, because it just is like, this is silly that I haven't finished this book.
Yeah.
And God put it on my heart all these years ago, and I just didn't complete the task. Kind of like the going to seminary thing, God's got to smack you upside the head sometimes.
Yeah.
So the whole concept of it, though, is the theory of looking back in my life, at least, is you had black and white, you had color TVs, you were the remote, the whole typical thing you hear. But the fact that once I first saw HD TV, I was just like, wow, right? The clarity, the detail. So the concept of the book is that's how a lot of people, Christians, live their life, is they're living in that analog life with God. And they're just not going to that point where they see God in a clear way, that they see God in everything in their lives and stuff. And when that happens, that just changes you. And just like an HD TV, once you've seen it, you don't want to go back to the old analog. Right. You're not, I know you're huge into sports, Brandon, as you're not going to want to watch those sports in a regular analog. That HD is just so much clearer, right? Yeah. So it's that concept is to help take you on a journey to get where you're seeing God in HD in your life, and you don't want to go back to the old.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And I think what's great is knowing both of you and the titles of these books, the contents of the books, and just like the pureness of like, man, we just want to, this is kind of what God has done in us, and we just want to share that with other people. And so we will link to all of those links in the show notes. They can get them on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, which is awesome.
That's awesome. So cool.
And so we'll link to all that in the show notes, but it's Choosing Joy and God in HD. What are other things that you guys are doing, that people can get involved with, other things that you're serving in the community or nonprofits, ministries, things like that you're involved with? Yeah.
So I'm on the board of Whitestone Ministries and led by Jeff and Danielle Batson. And so that is serving our homeless community. And so that is a fantastic ministry to be involved with.
Shane, what are other things that you're involved with? Tell us about One Mission Society. How can people learn more about that and other things that you've got going on in the community?
Okay, well, you mentioned earlier MyHome4 Good.
Yeah.
So that is with real estate. When Lee Smith and I decided to partner together on a lot of things, we currently are both with At Properties now, but we decided to create this vision of MyHome4 Good. And the concept is anybody that buys or sells or builds a home, we would take a quarter point of the commission and we would donate it to a charity they chose.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Right? And it was I remember having this discussion on it because it was like, all right, what if it's something that might not align with who we are? And we're like, well, if that's what it is, that's what God's plan is. We're gonna use it for what it is, right? Yeah. So that's what we've done, and I couldn't tell you the numbers now because Lee keeps track, but I think it's somewhere around $200,000 has been donated.
It's awesome
since we started. So that's that part of it. One mission. A lot of what I do is overseas. You can go to onemissonsociety.org and see more on it, but we're in over 70 countries. The main work we're doing overseas with what I do is church planting, evangelism, discipleship. The works within that with nationals. So I work with nationals within the countries who work with leaders in those countries to help build and lift them up and things.
It's awesome.
So encouraging. I love seeing Lee post photos of those checks on LinkedIn, Instagram, and just seeing the impact that you guys are able to make through that. It's so exciting.
That's the funnest part, honestly, is that check.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
It's being able to know you have that check that you're going to give to somebody.
Yeah.
It's really good. And we love our friends at Whitestone Ministries, and they've been involved with different programs here, and we love the work they're doing. And there's a lot of collaboration with some other works that are coming around that people are hanging out in this network. So,
and if you haven't heard our episode with them, we will link to that in the show
we
notes.
interviewed Danielle in the first season. So that was
way
like
back when.
2 years ago now.
I know, but it was a great conversation.
It was a great conversation. She's awesome. So, well, we want to say thanks to all of you for tuning into this episode of the 4 Everyday Leaders podcast by Wayfinders. We hope it helps you lead in the everyday spaces and moments of life.
Yeah, and we would love for you to continue joining us on the journey of the 4 Everyday Leaders podcast. You can subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, Anchor, YouTube, Apple Podcast. Shane and Sherri, thanks so much for taking some time to chat with us. This was such an encouraging conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.